Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the war in Ukraine because Donald Trump and President Putin have now had a conversation. And whilst that doesn't sound like that big a news event, this is actually the first time that the leaders of the USA and Russia have had any direct correspondence since February 2022 when Joe Biden contacted Putin before the invasion of Ukraine started. So this is the first time in 3 years that the two countries have actually started talking to each other directly. And this is, of course, in line with what Donald Trump said in the run-up to becoming president. He said that he was going to bring the war in Ukraine to a swift conclusion. He originally said he was going to finish it before he took over as president, then said was going to finish it in one day. Hasn't quite worked out like that, but I think the reality of the situation is that it's going to take a bit of time to get some form of agreement that everybody can sign up to. Now, in terms of what was said in this 90-minute conversation, Donald Trump, not surprisingly, has posted a message onto his social media platform, Truth Social. And for those of you that aren't following Donald Trump on Truth Social, I thought it was worth having a look at this message. It says, "I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we likewise lost so many. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We've also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. I've asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. Millions of people have died in a war that should not have happened if I were president, but it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call, and for the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon." So it seems that a nice time was had by everybody that was involved in that call, but in terms of the details, what's actually being put forward as the proposal that everybody's got to consider agreeing to, no details have been provided in that post. But in terms of what we know so far, there's already been a very strong indication that any peace agreement will be based on Russia maintaining the land that it's currently occupying, because Russia simply won't agree to withdraw all of its troops and go back to the original borders before the invasion started in February 2022. And this map shows the current position in terms of the area that Russia is occupying. The orange sections here are the areas that Russia was previously occupying following its invasion of Crimea back in 2014. And the yellow section is the new land that's been taken as part of the invasion that started 3 years ago. And this occupied area accounts for around 20% of the total landmass of Ukraine. And in addition to Russia maintaining the occupied land, it's also been mooted that Ukraine won't be allowed to join NATO because that's another sticking point for Russia. They don't want Ukraine being part of NATO and therefore potentially bringing NATO right onto Russia's doorstep along the Ukraine-Russian border. And Donald Trump has also been very forthright in terms of who's been footing the bill for the war in Ukraine so far. He thinks that Europe hasn't been pulling its weight and that Europe now needs to step up and start making more expenditure, giving more money over to Ukraine. And that doesn't just mean helping it in terms of providing arms. This is also talking about if there is a peace agreement, there will need to be peacekeepers that are put into an area. Potentially, there could be a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine in a similar sort of way to what we have between North and South Korea, where there's an area of no man's land, which is heavily fortified and both areas have protection on either side. if we have a similar situation between Ukraine and Russia, then somebody is going to have to police that, and that's going to cost a lot of money. And the latest cost estimate for how much it's going to be to maintain a status quo going forward and also to rebuild Ukraine is that the bill will come in at around $3 trillion US, and Donald Trump believes that that will all need to be funded by Europe. And in terms of how much of that funding will be needed to rebuild Ukraine, the current estimate is $234 billion. And as you can see from this chart, there is a funding gap at the moment of at least $134 billion, which is going to have to be picked up by Europe because Donald Trump firmly believes that it's now Europe's obligation to sort things out. So what has the initial global reaction been to the conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Michael McFaul, who served as the US ambassador to Russia between 2012 and 2014, posted the following messages on X. The first read, Diplomacy 101. Don't give anything without getting something in return. Don't negotiate in public. Don't negotiate about Ukraine's future without first coordinating your position with Ukrainians. He followed that by saying the Defense Secretary has just articulated his administration's willingness to give Putin two giant victories, Ukrainian land and no Ukrainian membership in NATO. What did he get from Putin in return? Nothing. This is not how you negotiate with Putin. And his third post on the matter said, why is the Trump administration giving Putin gifts? Ukrainian land and no NATO membership for Ukraine before negotiating even begins. I've negotiated with the Russians. You never give up anything to them for free. Dmitry Medvedev, who was formerly the president of Russia between 2008 and 2012, came out and made statements about the USA defeating Russia and said that it would never be achieved. He said, there is not and cannot be a main country and a senior ruler of the planet. This lesson should be learned by the arrogant American elites. It is impossible to bring us to our knees, and the sooner our opponents realise this, the better. However, in terms of the official response to the phone call and the prospect of peace in Ukraine, the Kremlin's official spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, President Putin, in his turn, emphasised the need to remove the root causes of the conflict and agreed with Trump that a long-term settlement could be achieved through peace talks, and went on to say that the Russian president supported the notion that the time has come for our countries to work together and had invited Trump to visit Moscow. Putin also expressed his readiness to receive US officials in Russia on areas of mutual interest, including the topic of Ukraine and the Ukrainian settlement. And it's been reported that China has now offered to host a peace summit to bring all of the key actors in the war in Ukraine together around the table in an attempt to thrash out a peace agreement that can be signed by everybody. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking about the war in Ukraine for the last 3 years, and obviously at certain times it didn't look like there was any end in sight. But Donald Trump has made it one of his missions to try to bring some form of peace agreement to the table. And he's following on from what he said in his election campaign and also whilst he was waiting to take over as the president, that he was going to do something about it. And he's now made the first step on that journey. He's made the call, which is the first time that the leaders of the USA and Russia have spoken to each other for almost 3 years. So this is a move in the right direction. But I guess the big question is, what does that peace deal look like? And is it going to be acceptable to both Ukraine and Europe and all of the other parties who've been supporting Ukraine over the past 3 years? And also, I guess, Russia as well need to sign up to it, because clearly if they don't, then there won't be any chance of any peace. But it looks likely that the proposal being put forward is going to include Russia keeping all of the land that it's currently occupying, which obviously is quite controversial because that's the whole point of the war. Ukraine didn't want to give over that land to Russia, but we are where we are, and I think that's Donald Trump's view, is that he needs to bring a peace settlement to the table. He doesn't want to argue over who owns the land and who should be taking control of it. He wants to just get something agreed. So realistically, Russia isn't going to agree to pull out of all of those areas. So the only chance of achieving peace will be to offer Russia to keep all of everything that it's taken so far. And I guess from Ukraine's point of view, they would need to be comfortable, firstly, with that concept, letting that land go in the same way as Crimea went back in 2014. But then from Ukraine's perspective, the big question is, How do they feel comfortable that Russia isn't going to decide that it's going to invade again in another 6 months or 12 months or 5 years or whenever? And this will really come down to having some sort of peacekeeping force, somebody on the ground that will be able to maintain that new border. And the USA has already said that it won't be them. They're not going to send troops. They're not going to fund any peacekeeping mission. That's down to Europe. And the estimated cost of that could be as high as $3 trillion. Now, obviously, as part of the peace agreement, Europe would need to sign up to that. They would need to say, okay, we're happy that we're going to fund all of that peacekeeping. That's going to be a big issue. Also, the rebuilding of Ukraine is going to be a big cost and a big issue. And Donald Trump wants Europe to cover all of that cost as well. So there's a lot of cost being pushed over to Europe to sort things out. And a lot of European countries are teetering on the brink of recession at the moment. We've got Germany that's in recession. We've got the UK that's just about avoiding recession. France is struggling with high levels of debt. And we've got a lot of other countries that are really struggling in terms of growth at the moment. So it's going to be a big ask for all of those countries to sign up to this. But I guess the big picture position here is that if it does bring a war to an end, it stops people dying, it brings some sort of peace to Europe, then theoretically, that could be a good thing. Obviously, there's lots of issues to discuss in terms of the occupied land and all of the people who died and the damage that's been caused to Ukraine so far. But I think Donald Trump is trying to get something agreed. It's the first steps that we've seen towards any sort of peace settlement, and it will be fascinating to see what happens over the next few weeks and months, because this is likely to take months. It's not going to happen overnight, even though Donald Trump did say that he could sort it out in one day. Realistically, that's not the way Russia works. And it will be fascinating to see what happens, whether or not we do see a peace summit being agreed in China or somewhere else around the world, who attends that, and whether or not an agreement can be thrashed out and the war in Ukraine can finally be brought to a conclusion at some point in 2025. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.